Hey everybody, it is Wintermute here at the Think Tank. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to talk about what my general strategy was going into Crimsontide with the Commonwealth. Now, I know I'd said I was going to do this kind of discussion with Jinx. Unfortunately, life is just life, and he's really busy with work and whatnot. So we just haven't been able to. Our schedules just haven't been able to line up. I also originally had wanted to do a video like this prior to even starting Crimsontide. So it was, number one, it was done. Number two, I could kind of release it and then do a tack on follow-up segment where I kind of go, okay, well, that didn't work. Or, start really picking apart what, how things kind of worked. But at least have the general strategy laid out before I started playing. But, so one thing about the Commonwealth in general is I think it is the most difficult nation to play in global war. It has so much on its plate, so much to do. It is so, in some ways, chopped up in ways. It is really it's between the hammer and the anvil, in an extremely difficult position. And so I really wanted, when I looked at this, and this is the first time I've been able to play a single nation by itself. Usually when I play, I'm playing the Allies, or I'm playing the Axis, or I'm playing the Comintern. This is my first opportunity to play a nation by itself. So that gave me a chance to really do a bit of a deeper dive and really analyze what I thought about that nation and what I thought the best ways for them to play were. So, one of the things that I've noticed with the Commonwealth that I see happen is London falls, or Calcutta falls, or Egypt falls, or Sydney falls. And I'm just like, okay, I can't let that happen. Or if it does happen, it is going to be so bloody for the Axis that they're never going to recover. And that was one of the key things mindsets that I went into this with. So there are basically 4 points on the map that I said, okay, these are super important, and the bulk of my initial game economy is going to go into reinforcing them to a point where they are either completely off the table as far as the Axis being able to get them, like not worth the effort, or if they do, like I said, they are going to have to fight tooth and nail. They're going to have to throw in everything they got to really get it. Because if they half-ass it, then and they fail, well, then that could be game changing for them. Could break the back of their army. So the key points when I looked at my overall strategy, basically, obviously London, Egypt, Gibraltar, Calcutta, and Sydney. Now, there's other points on the map that became important, like Aden, but they weren't do or die holdout positions. Now, my goal was to those 5 positions, fortify them to such a point where I can strike out from a position of strength without having to put too much worry into whether they're going to be taken. Or again, if they are, if things go wrong, they're at least defended to such an extent that it was a hell of a fight to take it. So you saw that from the very beginning. I started, as soon as I could, I started a fortification in Calcutta, a fortification in Sydney. Those were 2 key points that I really wanted to do from the beginning of the game. And then once I had them fortified, then the rest of my economy was just going to be building up forces to strike out from there, knowing that I had a secure base from which to project my threat from. So, London fell into that same category. Now, I did not build a fortification in London. The reason being is because I knew I was going to have, hopefully, more than enough ground units or ability to put ground units there quickly if I needed to in London to, repel any sort of German invasion if need be. Or if they went up north to one of those northern areas or the Midlands, at least it wasn't London and I can fight for it. And there's, we can at least go tit for tat. It's not like a game changer like if they take London. Because that's just, you just can't let that happen. You just cannot let that happen as the Commonwealth. So, like I said, Gibraltar, and the main reason obviously Gibraltar. Now, Gibraltar was kind of it wasn't quite as much important to be able to fortify it to strike out from, but I could not let it fall into Italian hands. It was just it's too valuable. In some ways, it's better for them. It would be better if they took Egypt from me, because at least Egypt I can take back. I have a chance of taking back. So, keeping that in mind, that I wanted those points, those strong points that are super important, and then from there I was going to project out my threat from. They're also kind of like pivot points. So, London, my units in London and the fleets around London, if they need to threaten Norway, Denmark, northern Germany, of course the coast of France, but if I needed to bring that threat down here all of a sudden and threaten the Mediterranean or reinforce Gibraltar, it can pivot whichever direction I want it. Same thing more or less with Egypt. Do I need to go into northern Africa? Do I need to go into the Middle East? Do I need to send transports to pick up guys to go help take back the Balkans or threaten Turkey if Italy were to get Turkey, whatever the case may be? So that was also kind of it was a very defended pivot point. To a lesser extent, Aden was part of that. Now, Aden was not a fortified area like Sydney or Calcutta or Gibraltar was, but it was a very centralized point that was important, and I will come back to Aden on its own for its own merits. But then we go to Calcutta. Now, Calcutta, I can project threat into Southeast Asia, directly into China, down into the Money Islands, whatever. I can also project threat right up into the Middle East. I can immediately come over here and reinforce Eastern Egypt. And if I've got a fortification there, if I've got enough units there, stripping away a couple guys to come suddenly reinforce Egypt because Italy's dropping guys left and right now, not that big of a deal. Again, I can pivot up here in London, I can pivot around here in Gibraltar, I can pivot here in Egypt, I can pivot here in Calcutta, I can pivot here in Aden, depending on where I need the threat to go. Now, part of that aspect of the strategy, Sydney was not, in my mind, a pivot point. Sydney was simply it was more like a wall. I'm not projecting threat from Sydney. I had no intention of projecting threat from Sydney. And I'll get into how, that was obvious early on when I started moving my fleets around. But Sydney was going to be fortified, and it was going to fight for Australia. But I knew if the Japanese player wanted to come down and take those islands, it wasn't going to be the Aussies who were going to take it back. They were just too weak down there to start with, and the ability to reinforce them really wasn't practical in terms of them being able to project a threat. So I didn't consider Sydney a pivot point. I did consider Calcutta a pivot point. Like I said, Eastern Egypt paired with Aden, a pivot point, Gibraltar, and then London. So however the game flowed, I can go, okay, well, London needs to come down to Gibraltar. Calcutta needs to come up to support Eastern Egypt, so does Aden, and then we can suddenly put a lot of pressure, if not a direct attack, against the Italians. Or suddenly the Japanese are having a runaway game. All right, well, now Calcutta is going to push its threat that way. The guys in Aden are going to push that threat that way. Egypt, maybe we need to take some guys out of Egypt and move them over to Aden. Do we need more reinforcements down in Aden fleet-wise? Well, now we're going to take these fleets sitting off Gibraltar and pivot, and we're going to pivot those guys instead of going north to help protect London. They're going to come down here, and they're going to, and they can get from, and most of the ships, with the exception of the battleships and transports, could get from Gibraltar to Aden in one single move. So here, I've got this fleet off Gibraltar in Sea Zone 79, helping to protect the Atlantic, helping to project Gibraltar, projecting threat into the Mediterranean. If the German fleet comes out, I'm projecting threat up north towards London, up towards Canada, down into South Africa. Well, if I needed to shift that threat focus, now I need to project more threat over here. I'll shift it over to Aden, or some of it over to Aden, and now from Aden, I'm protecting down around the Horn and southern part of Africa. I'm still projecting threat into the Mediterranean if need be, but now I'm also projecting threat into the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. So those pivot points were kind of key. And that was the other reason you saw me build, I built Marines very early. And that's because I see too many Allied players, in my opinion, go way too defensive way too late into the game. and they have no ability to exploit any kind of opening in their opponent's strategy or setup, or maybe a battle went badly for them and they didn't have enough troops there. It's like, well, but now you got nothing to exploit it because all of your units are so defensive in nature, you have no threat projection. And that was another reason you saw that I built a lot of Marines early on in the game, because as soon as war broke out, I wanted those Marines to directly threaten everywhere they could reach for the Germans and Italians and the Japanese. And that was where Aden was kind of important in this, because Aden's in a very, and historically Aden was a super important port. And you do see that in this game because it's worth, I believe it's worth, I want to say a victory point. It's worth at least one victory point and at least one wartime bonus income. And I'm glad that they did that, because that does show the importance of Aden, which it gets overlooked kind of in other kind of games of this nature. But the neat thing about Aden is it's in this position where, I've got my troop transports there, and, they can reach, 1, 2, 3 up into this area, or 1, 2, 3 up here into the Mediterranean. So they actually can, my Marines that were here can project threat pretty decent direction. They can project threat down here if need be into around Africa. They can project threat out here into Southeast Asia. Let's say Japan comes over and takes Maharashtra, which is kind of or Southern India, which is a favorite of what I've seen of some Japanese players if they don't want to assault Calcutta directly. Well, now I actually have threat that I can project that way to try and take it back, depending on how many units they put over here. And you saw that I had the Aden fleet here. And this kind of goes into, so that's why I built a lot of Marines, and I built more offensive stuff early, and then I worried a little bit more about beefing up my defenses right before the war, because I wanted the offensive capability to be in existence when the time came. Because by the time if I need Marines to do an amphibious landing into, let's say he left something really weak up here in Belgium or even Western Germany, but all I have are I've got a couple standard infantry in London and not much else. Well, is that really enough to do anything? No, but if I've got at least 1 or 2, if you just, let's say I've got 4 infantry, if you change 2 of those 4 infantry into Marines, well, suddenly my ability to do an amphibious assault, and be successful at it is much, much higher. So again, I wanted to have that offensive capability right from the get-go of the war to exploit any mistakes that were made, any weaknesses that popped up as the game progressed. And with that in mind, you notice that I did a lot of movement with my fleets. And I knew early on what I wanted to do was set up a fleet here in Aden. But after I started doing the math, I realized, you know what? The battleship down there, over here in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, the ability to move fast is more important than it is in the Atlantic. And it's not important in the Atlantic. It is. You always want to be able to move as fast as you can. But the distance, it's just not as big a body of water. Over here, you want to traverse much longer distances much quicker. So with that in mind, I went ahead and I took all the battleships that were elsewhere in the world and I moved them up off London, or off Britain, because only having a movement of 2, 3 with the major port, they still were projecting more than enough threat. They were still being more than enough. They were more than enough power that the German player had to go, well, crap, there's 3 battleships there. That's some firepower that I have to think about. It also would help with shore landings and things like that, with those shore bombardments as the game progressed. Now, in exchange, I moved more of the, well, first I moved the battle cruiser down here to Aden, and then I sent a bunch of light and heavy cruisers down here, and I built a bunch of destroyers as the game went on. And that is because everything that I put here, with the exception of the transports, moved a minimum of 3, so it would be 4 from the Aden port. So now, because I'm not burdened with the battleship, if I want to if the Japanese player swings down here, and he breaks his fleet apart in a way that is, because he's trying to grab as much territory. Well, if he breaks it apart in a way that doesn't take into account, I have a pretty strong strike force here Suddenly I can shoot out there and start chipping away at his fleet. Because it's pretty hard for Japan to replace losses in its navy compared to some of the other nations. Because their economy just isn't, it takes time for them to ramp up their economy, and they put so much of their initial economy into ground forces. So, and with the transports here in Aden, that let me be able to, let's say he went down into Sumatra right away. Well, I could immediately follow up with a counterattack, chew up his fleet, and land troops in Sumatra if I wanted to take it back right away. So my ability to project threat that way from Aden was a lot better without the battleships. Also, another factor involved in that is that the Australian fleet basically was kind of pointless. I see no reason to keep it down there. I knew I wasn't going to be projecting any real threat. I wasn't going to all Sydney was going to do was defend. It would fight back to take Australia back from the Japanese if they started landing. But they were not going to project. They weren't going to do enough to really make it to make a big difference. So I immediately took their fleet, moved it over here to Aden, and had it doing other things that I felt were far more important. And that also, I see players, and you see this a lot in Axis and Allies, they just leave the British fleet down there in Southeast Asia, and it just ends up dying, doing very little damage, unless they're really lucky, to the Japanese fleet. I didn't want that to happen. So by pulling it, now I also was worried about him using a sneak attack, or just pouncing on it without the sneak attack to just get rid of it. And if he's calling the shots, he will make that battle be in his favor. So I wanted to pull my fleets away back here to Aden. And as soon as I did that, that made it a lot more difficult for him to strike out and just sink the whole fleet and just destroy the whole thing. And then I got nothing there. And again, he's because he's the one choosing the battle, he'll pick the best way to do it that's most favorable to him. And I didn't want to give him that option. I wanted to remove that from the table completely. Sure, he'll have his successful, probably first wave going into Southeast Asia, but then I still have options to counter him with. So, I also moved both of my carriers, obviously, up into the Atlantic, because they're carriers and they can go sub-hunting. And it turned out to be an absolute awesome decision. And that is one I do not question. You will see me probably do that every game from here on. Because the part of the other thing with the British fleets down here in India is they tend to just sit there doing nothing until Japan enters the war. I fully expected to go move the all the British stuff from here, form it up here in Aden, move some of those assets up here into the Atlantic, fight the Atlantic wall, a battle for the Atlantic, keep the Germans in check. But eventually I was going to move a good chunk of it back towards Aden just to have it ready to go against Japan, because obviously Germany tends to be far more aggressive early. Japan tends to be several turns later. So you have a couple turns there where I felt I might as well use the fleet that just would normally sit there doing nothing, bring it over the Atlantic, have it go sub-hunting, have it go do escort duty, have it just do more things, and then when the time come, when I felt Japan was going to get hinky, I'll go ahead and start, funneling it back towards Aden, which is where I wanted to be posted up anyway. I didn't want it to be any further than Aden, with a couple exceptions. I might have some ships out there doing escort duty, and I positioned some subs to immediately start counterattacking against Japan as well, and that was deliberate as well. And again, that's another aspect. I moved, with the exception of the coastal sub, which I moved from Southeast Asia up off London for reasons of raiding the German convoy line later on in the game. And I knew I was going to try that from before I started playing. So it took, 9 turns to move that coastal sub from Southeast Asia up to London. It was insane. It was like 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Yeah, it was like 9 turns. So it took 9 turns. Roughly 9 turns. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4.5 years to get that coastal sub off the coast of the United Kingdom, give or take 6 months. Well, 4 years to get that coastal sub home. But I knew that Coastal Sub was not going to be terribly effective down there, and I saw another use for him. Even if it was a one shot, one turn to go raid that Baltic submarine line or Baltic convoy line, I felt that was worth it. So that was kind of my overall strategy with the Commonwealth. There's a lot more to it. And now this video has gone on for about 20 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a part 2, maybe even 3, because there are other aspects that I want to kind of talk about, like the tech and the expansions and how that changed things. And there was a lot of other things little things that popped up that I did not necessarily cover in this discussion. I was giving a very broad overview. So if you've got any questions about anything, feel free to leave a comment asking me to clarify this and that. And one thing I will state right now is I like having my gameplay analyzed. I'm okay with that, so long as you're polite about it. It's good I feel good to be challenged, and if I can't come up with a good counter, then maybe I need to rethink my position. And rethink my strategy. And this, I will say, my entire overall strategy was not tested prior to this. This was the first time I was putting it into effect. So I knew that there was a chance the entire thing could fail from the get-go. But I'm okay with that. I'm not worried about losing a game in the eye of the public. Like I said, I enjoy being challenged. I enjoy pushing the envelope. I enjoy trying new things with a game of this nature and trying new strategies, fully accepting that they may not work. And I've gotten into numerous discussions with people who have said, oh, that will never work because of X, or that's a silly idea, or whatever. And it's like, well, let's try it. And then we try it, and you know what? One or both of us end up being kind of wrong. One ends up being right, one ends up being wrong. Okay? You do your best to kind of, anticipate what's going to happen. But until you put the guys on the map and really do the math and really, really move the pieces, things, you can only theorize. You got to get out there and do it at some point. So in some ways, that's what Crimsontide was. It was me really trying a strategy that had been percolating in my mind for a while. So I'm happy to have feedback. I'm happy to have you bring up points, and say, hey, what about this? Or did you think about this? Or, and there are aspects of this that I would change now and rethink. But that was my overall strategy, not taking into account what actually happened within the game. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to wrap this video up here. I'm going to do at least a number 2 because this ended up going a little longer than I anticipated. But for right now, this is Wintermute signing out from the Think Tank.